Good evening everyone, and welcome to this Facebook Live transmission for the Cambridge Photography Week. We're here this evening in our studio. We're based up in Knowsley Safari Park up in the northwest, so not local to Cambridge, but on a wet, windy evening it's the perfect place to be in order to do some photography. So this evening we're going to talk through macro photography and try and cover some of the common issues and problems and common solutions to help everyone get better pictures. We're lucky here in as much as we can photograph in a nice controlled environment, not least with the addition of some nice subjects. So hopefully you can see on the screen there behind me we've got a fantastic little gargoyle gecko who is sat out ready to pose for us. And through the next hour, hopefully we're going to go through some different subjects, different things to photograph. And as we're talking about things, you'll be able to see the results up on the screen and we'll get some pictures of the animals as we go through. So that's kind of the plan. If anyone's got any thoughts or questions, I've got a couple of the guys with me here and they'll be spotting any questions that come through, and we will try and do our best to answer those things. If for whatever reason we can't lay our hands on the answer straight away, then we'll try and kind of get back to people individually, but we'll do our best to answer your questions. Obviously this evening is being sponsored by Canon, and we're Canon shooters, so we've got Canon equipment with us this evening, but many of the things that we're talking about, all the kind of ideas and principles, will translate across to any other brand as well. So whilst we're looking at Canon cameras, all of the ideas would be just as applicable for Nikon or Sony or Panasonic or Olympus or anything else. But forgive us for talking about the specifics of Canon as we go through. So probably the first problem that people really encounter is having the right equipment, having the right lenses to simply get close enough to be able to get the small subject big enough in the picture to get the composition that you're looking for. And that's a reasonably complicated thing to describe. So we use in the industry a measurement called reproduction ratio to help us get a handle on how well our equipment, how well our lenses are going to work in that specific sense. How big will I be able to make my small subject in the resulting picture at closest distance, at minimum focusing distance? Now I guess the benchmark for this, where it all kind of starts, is this kind of lens. This is a Canon 100mm 2.8 macro lens, a lens that is specifically targeted at that need. And that lens, in common with many other lenses of its type, all of those bespoke macro lenses, have a reproduction ratio of 1:1 or life size. And this might have been an expression that you've heard about, it's bounced around a lot, and it's become our kind of normal, common expectation of what those kind of lenses are capable of achieving. But in terms of what it actually means, that's something that we can try and illustrate. I'm going to be a little bit ambitious here. You know the old adage about never working with animals and children? Well, obviously we're not going to try and do that this evening, but we're going to see what we can do. So what I'm going to try and do is put this 100mm macro lens into its minimum distance with our little gecko friend here, and that will give you some sense of kind of what it will do. So I'm just going to have to shuffle the camera a little bit closer because I can see that we're not quite where we need to be at the moment. I'm actually going to put the focusing, I'm on manual focus at the moment, I'm going to put that focusing to the minimum distance, and then all I've really got to do is get the camera close enough so that the subject becomes in focus. Now I can help that a little bit because I'm actually using a focusing rail on the camera, so I can actually just adjust that very fine bit of movement there. I just need to open my shutter up a little bit to get that exposure right, but there we are, that's minimum distance. So that's the 100mm macro lens in at minimum distance, and the reproduction ratio that you're seeing on the screen there is 1:1 or life size. What that means is, at minimum distance, the thing that we are photographing, the gecko in this case, that gecko will be recorded on the image, on the sensor inside the camera, as big as it really is, or 1:1 or life size. We're shooting with the latest Canon 1DX here, which is full frame. So it's a full frame sensor. So what that means is this area that we're seeing on the screen, the subject area, is exactly the same size as a full frame sensor. So roughly 24mm by 36mm. So there we are, 1:1 reproduction ratio with a bespoke macro lens. Obviously it's no problem, I can move the camera further away. All of these macro lenses will have a full focusing range, so they'll focus from minimum right the way out to infinity. I can compose a picture wider if I want to. I don't have to go into those tight compositions. It's just a question of moving further away if you want more space around you. Now, if we compare that with general purpose lenses, these are the kind of lenses that you may well have bolted onto your camera for sort of day-to-day photography. In the case of full frame, it's probably things like 24-105s, 24-70s, that kind of thing. If you're on a 1.6 crop, it might be 1855s, 1870, that kind of lens. Those general purpose lenses will be reasonably good at photographing small things, but not as good as the bespoke macro lenses with their 1:1 reproduction ratio. Those lenses, the general purpose lenses, will probably have a reproduction ratio rating within their specifications of something like 1:4 or maybe 1:5. In other words, with the lens at its minimum distance, as close as it will let you go, the thing that you are photographing will be recorded on the image, on the sensor, not life size, but a quarter, 1/4 life size, or a fifth, 1:5, fifth life size. So not as big, not as close. Still perfectly adequate for getting pictures on a wider scale, but it's not going to perform as well as those bespoke macro lenses with their reproduction ratio of 1:1. A fairly common question at this point is people will say, I get that, I understand 1:1, but how is that affected by different sensor sizes? So if you're shooting on one of the APS-C sensors, things like a 90D, historically things like 70 Mark IIs, or Nikon equivalents, you have a proportionately smaller sensor. Even smaller still if you're shooting Micro Four Thirds with Olympus or Panasonic. From the lens's point of view though, that really doesn't make any difference. It's still doing the job of projecting that image back onto the sensor to record the image life size. But of course what does vary is, if you like, how big the canvas is upon which that picture is created. So if it's full frame, the life-size subject will have some space around it. As the sensors get smaller, there is less space around it. And that leads to a certain extent to this relatively common myth that smaller sensors are better at macro than larger sensors. And I guess if you're purely interested in how big will my little thing be within my sensor area, my subject area, there is some truth in that. But of course the larger sensors, particularly if the pixel count is higher, will have the ability to crop down and maybe kind of rival that. So the lenses don't really work any differently regardless of the sensor size. So from our point of view, in the studio, as we're shooting at the moment, these kind of lenses are perfect. 100mm macro lenses, I can push in, do that 1:1 picture, as we did just a moment ago, that headshot, or I can back off a little bit and get a wider picture. I think we have a question.
We have. Have we got any thoughts on using non-macro lenses with extension tubes to get close focus distance?
A good question. So, we're going to run away for just a second. Extension tubes. If you're not familiar with extension tubes, they are pretty much what their name suggests. They are a spacing ring that sits between the camera lens and the body. They are just a pipe, no glass in it, just a spacing ring. So you can stick your finger straight through the middle. And they have a very basic function. So as you introduce that gap between the camera body and the lens, what that extension tube will do will effectively distort the focusing range of the lens that's bolted on the front. So if you have a lens that has a minimum focusing distance, let's say something like a 24-70, 24-105 will probably have a minimum focusing distance of maybe 50-60 centimetres, and at 50-60 centimetres the subject at closest distance will be recorded quarter life size perhaps, that kind of thing. Drop an extension tube in behind it, the whole focusing range shunts closer. You do lose the ability to focus on infinity, you can't do that anymore, but crucially you gain the ability to get the camera a little bit closer, reduce that effective minimum focusing distance, and of course as the camera gets closer, the subject gets bigger, and then the potential reproduction ratio rises. So extension tubes will work behind general purpose lenses, they'll work behind macro lenses, they are usually fairly universal in their application. We have to be a little bit careful because some lens designs are a little bit more complicated and extension tubes don't work so well. But with things like 24-105s, 24-70s, it's definitely worth a try. And you should be able to push your reproduction ratio capability from 1 to 4, 1 to 5 as it is out the box, to maybe 1 to 3 or something like that, something a little bit better, something a little bit closer. Probably won't rival the bespoke macro lens, and the extension tubes do come with a couple of little difficulties. One difficulty being that you do have a defined focusing range, so you will lose the ability, as I've already said, to focus on infinity or those further distances. It's quite a defined focusing range with each extension tube, and you do lose a little bit of light because the light has to travel further from the back of the lens through onto the sensor. Extension tubes often come in sets of 3, so the principle is the bigger the extension, the bigger the gap, the bigger the shift in the focusing range, the closer you can get, the smaller the subject ends up being in the resulting image. So you can flex the amount of extension to flex the effect that the extension tubes will have on the lens. Actually, we use this is a Canon 25mm extension tube, and we use that on the back of the 100mm macro lens because we know that the 100mm macro gives us capability to do 1:1 or life size. If I pop that tube behind it, I can push that lens in closer still and maybe get to something like 1.5 times greater than life size. So the subject is recorded on the image on the sensor 1.5 times bigger than it really is. So I can bolster the performance of even my bespoke macro lens by adding an extension tube in. They're very handy accessories to have and quite versatile in their application. I think we have another question.
We do. Is it better to use a big aperture, so a small f number, and do focus stacking, or have a smaller aperture?
Another good question. So I think I'm going to park that question just for a second. We kind of talked about simply getting close enough. So we have a little bit of an idea about macro lenses, reproduction ratios, general purpose lenses. Thanks to the question there, we brought in extension tubes too, so that's all great. Once we start photographing at a closer distance, which maybe we can kind of demonstrate a little bit here again. Let me just push in a little bit with our gecko friend. Still being super patient, bless him. There we go, there's a bit of a picture. So we're photographing at relatively close range. We then tend to come into this problem of focus. Focus in macro pictures is inherently quite critical. There is this secondary principle of depth of field, depth of focus, that suggests that the closer the lens and the camera gets to the subject, inherently the narrower or shallower the depth of focus or depth of field will be for any given aperture. And we clearly see that with things like the macro lenses. So as we push closer, we tend to get shots that have narrow, shallow depth of focus or depth of field. So I'm just going to quickly make a little adjustment there. So that picture is with this lens at its widest aperture, 2.8. You can see the shot on the screen there. I know it's relatively small on your screens at home, but we have pretty narrow focus. You can see the focus is tailing off quite acutely on the back of his head, and we're losing focus on his nose there. So I'm going to take a couple of shots just to illustrate this. So I'm getting a pretty good exposure there. I've pushed my shutter speed up to compensate for the wider aperture, so I'm at 2.8 at 800th of a second. We'll just pop a shot off there so we can see that. But I want to now see the effect of closing that aperture down. So if I'm able to close that aperture down, let's go to maybe something like f8, a medium-sized aperture. I'm just going to balance the exposure up to a similar level again. There we go, pretty similar. And then we'll close that aperture down some more. Maybe we'll go to something like f16. Again, I need to balance the exposure a little bit because, of course, as I close that aperture down, we are gradually getting less light. We'll just nip the ISO up a little bit to help that. So I have to compensate for that smaller aperture, less light is coming in, but I will get more depth of field. So let's just pop that picture off as well. And then if we look at those on replay, there's the first picture. You can see 800th per second, 2.8. I don't know if we can change lens maybe. Can that work? Can we use the telephoto lens? No, we can't. So
I can move in though.
We're just going to move the camera in a little bit so you can see. There we go. I'm going to get a little bit more intimate. In these strange times, I don't think you should be this close. You're not 2 meters away. But you can see 2.8, pretty shallow depth of field. As we close the aperture down to f8, you can see that there's a clear difference. Pretty out of focus at 2.8, back of the head and even on the nose. As we go to f8, we're starting to get more depth of focus, more depth of field, getting a bit of sharpness on the nose, a bit of sharpness on the back of the head. And as we go to f16, now we've got pretty much comprehensive depth of field from the end of the nose right through the head, through onto his shoulder. So we're getting significantly different amounts of depth of focus or depth of field by using different size apertures. So that's a real kind of fundamental idea, and we are often slightly preoccupied with accuracy of focus and quantity of focus in the macro pictures that we are shooting. Now the question was, what's better? Using small apertures, a bit like we did with f16 there, or using a more complex technique of focus stacking? I guess they both have their advantages and disadvantages. On a simplistic level, if we're doing this thing of shooting single images, which is what we're doing here, then obviously we've only got the one integral raw image in the first place to look at. So we've only got that one shot. We're just flexing the depth of focus or depth of field by using the apertures. And actually with this kind of size subject, pushing up above f8, f11, f16 will give us depth of field that is probably workable. It means, of course, that I can record my entire image in that split second of a single shot. If I was going to do a stack of this little gecko, the principle of stacking is that we take multiple images and each image would be effectively focused in slightly different places. So I would do this kind of thing, focus on the closest bit and then click, 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 take a series of pictures as we move the focus through the subject, and then we end up with a set of pictures. It might be 5, 8, 10, 15 different pictures. The only difference in those images is where the focus sits within the subject. What we can then do is use some clever software like Photoshop or many other kind of similar versions of the same thing, and we stack, blend or combine those images to end up with a single result using just the in-focus sharp bits of all the donor images. It's a super cool technique and it gives us an extra dimension of control in terms of focus. Its big limitation is how still is the subject going to be for the time it takes to generate multiple images. So all of these critters, this little gecko has moved a bit just as we've been talking. He's just drifting his head down a little bit. And if there was that movement in his head as I'm taking the pictures, that will prevent those images going into a successful stack. So that's the fundamental downside, is how long it takes to generate the set of pictures. In this kind of environment, what we tend to do, we're using continuous light at the moment. We're going to talk a bit about flash a little bit later on, but continuous light at the moment. What I would do is pretty much what I did then. I wouldn't attempt to move the camera. I would use a fairly fast frame rate on the camera, and then I would just manually pull focus through the subject, firing the shutter quite quickly. So I should be able to take 5, 6, 7 pictures in under a couple of seconds, so relatively quick. Another question, I think.
Some people were struggling to see that, so I'll take this off if you could show those pictures again.
Yeah, okay, so we're going to lift the camera off a tripod so you can see that again, just so that I can talk through those pictures again. Janet's going to bring the camera around. It's a slightly awkward quick release on the tripod. So there we go. That's the shot. You can see the settings here. We're at 1600 ISO, we've got 800th of a second and 2.8. Nice focus on the eye. We're losing the focus a bit on the end of the nose, and we've definitely lost focus on the back of the head. Let's see if we can skip that through to the, there it is, the f8 picture. F8, we've changed our shutter speed to compensate for that, but now we've got good sharpness right the way through this area of the head where the eye is, through onto the nose, which is lovely, and we're just starting to lose focus on the back of the head. By the time I click through to F16, clearly focus right the way from his nose, pin sharp on the end of his nose, right the way through his head, and we're even starting to get a little bit more detail on his shoulder and on his leg. So hopefully you can see there is clearly different amounts of focus. Before we put the camera back, let's just see if we can give a sense to the guys that are watching how big the gecko is, because you don't really know how big this guy is. So Janet's just going to bring the camera around, and I just want to show you, this is one of my favourite geckos. This is a little guy called Mitchell, but you can see just by the size of my fingers how big his head is. His head's about the size of my thumb. So he's relatively small when we're talking about a headshot of him. So he's a little guy, you know. So, but you can imagine when we're photographing a head of an animal that's about the size of your thumb, that variation in depth of field is really measured in millimetres. You know, it's small amounts of shift. So even when we were looking at that shot at f16, we're probably running through a total amount of depth of field of maybe about 20 mil or something like that. If the lens was pushed into its minimum distance, the 1-to-1 reproduction ratio type level, life size on the resulting image, that would be even less. The depth of focus or depth of field will gradually diminish as we push in closer and closer. So focus is a big deal, and it's a perfectly good question to ask about small apertures versus stacking. One thing I would say, and normally how we start that section, is of course all of this hinges on how accurately your camera focuses on the first place. Again, if you were looking at this picture as we do this live view feed, you can see just how critical that flex in the focus is just as I'm moving that focusing ring. You can see that focus pushing through the head of our little gecko friend here, and it's really small differences. I'm moving the focusing ring just tiny amounts. So accurate focus becomes quite important. At the moment I'm focusing manually. That's just because I want a little bit of control, and I'm running the camera on live view to kick a feed up onto the monitor. But normally I would probably use autofocus, particularly with these new cameras. The AF is just awesome for these kind of situations. But what I would be doing is making sure that the camera is focusing absolutely where I want it to. So I need to have very kind of precise focus. So I will be using maybe just a single focus point. On the Canons I have the option to do even a spot focus point, smaller still, and I'm getting that focus point right on the eye, for example, right on the key part of the subject. So, you know, you might take a picture of the gecko and the gecko just isn't quite sharp in the right places. But then if I was to ask, where did you focus? You know, you need to be able to say, I focused right in the middle of the gecko's right-hand eye. It probably won't be good enough to say, I think I focused on the gecko. It has to be quite precise. So once we've got that real precision in our focusing, then we've thought about the size of aperture so that we can start to anticipate the depth of focus or depth of field. And then we can start getting the kind of focus where we want it to be. There will be some subjects, partly because they sit still and partly because you need more focus in them anyway, that will be perfectly suited to a kind of stacking approach. But that is a little bit more complicated. It does require some software, it does require some practice and experience and thinking about. A good place to start, if you haven't done macro before, is just pretty much what we're doing now. Camera body, if you can get your hands on a bespoke macro lens, check that reproduction ratio, it should be 1-to-1 or life size. Things like the Canon 100mm are just perfect. Then you can push those lenses into their minimum distance, you're getting up to life size, and if you close the aperture down to anywhere between sort of f16, f22, you'll be getting good enough depth of field to be getting some very pleasing images. So depth of focus, depth of field is a really big topic of conversation. It does kind of lead us on though to the third thing that we want to talk about, which is slightly ironically shutter speed. And we've kind of seen that already with what we've done. What we might do, just as I'm talking, I don't know if we maybe want to swap subject because you guys presumably would like to see some different animals. So We're going to put Mitchell to bed. It's actually first thing in the morning for Mitchell because he's a nocturnal gecko, so he's just kind of got up and he's thinking about having breakfast. So we're going to go pop him back. What we're going to do is hopefully Janet's going to get out for us a little bit of an insect that will sit a little bit more stationary, a little bit more predictably still. So we've got some very cool little things called jungle nymphs, which are kind of a posh stick insect. So we're going to swap the animal a little bit.
I have got a couple of questions in the pipeline for you as well.
Okay, a couple of questions.
So
we have a question coming through. Bear with us just 1 second. We're just gecko swapping, multitasking here.
So, reversing rings with the 35-50mm primes. What is your opinion on those?
Another good question. So if we go back into the past a little bit, things like reversing rings were a very cheap, popular, common way of enabling your optics to get closer. A peculiarity of lenses like 50mm primes is if you turn them round and stick them on the camera back to front, they effectively have a much, much closer minimum focusing distance. So the principle of a reversing ring is absolutely that. You unbolt the lens off of the front of the camera, turn it round, fit a bayonet adapter onto the filter thread on the front of the lens and bolt the lens onto the camera backwards. Now in the good old bad old days of manual focus lenses with mechanically controlled irises, that was pretty easy because you would bolt it on backwards, you would focus on a focusing rail or manually, and then you could just use the click stop aperture adjustment to adjust the aperture in the lenses. Of course, the reality of modern electronic lenses is all those mechanisms are controlled electronically. So you will struggle to get access to the focusing control because there is many lenses don't have access to a non-powered focusing mechanism, and you'll struggle to get control of the aperture. The lens, depending on the manufacturer, may default to its widest aperture, it may even default to its minimum aperture, but you will struggle to get control because you haven't got a camera bolted onto those electronic contacts on the back of the lens to take control of the aperture mechanism and the focus mechanism. So that's the big limitation. No problem at all if you want to get hold of one of those adapter rings and just kind of flip the lens around and have a play with it, and maybe it will do exactly what you want, but it is going to be significantly harder to use than something like a bespoke macro lens. I'm very aware that a bespoke macro lens costs hundreds of pounds, and a reversing ring off of the internet might cost a fiver. But there's a reason for that. The reversing ring is a fairly kind of simple thing, will have a fairly kind of narrow area of operation. The beauty of the bespoke macro lenses, as we've already said, they've got a full focusing range right the way from infinity right the way down to minimum. We've got great autofocus with these model lenses with ultrasonic motors and stuff in the lenses. This one's got image stabilisation as well. We've got full use of that aperture range from 2.8 to the widest right the way through. So a much, much easier piece of kit to take control of. I think we're just sorting out our little critter here. Did we have another question, Janet?
We do indeed. So we have you ever used the Raynox 250 DCR?
I think Raynox 250 DCR. The short answer is no, I haven't, but I think I know what the Raynox system essentially comprises of. So Raynox, if I've got this wrong then forgive me, but I'm pretty sure that a Raynox is basically an accessory that screws into the filter thread on the front of the lens. It is extra glass, extra elements that you are adding to the optical configuration of the lens, again to distort the focusing range of the lens that you're bolting the accessory onto. The advantage, if you think about it, of our little extension tube is that actually it's not putting any glass in the way at all. The glass, the optics that are generating the image are the ones that the lens had all by itself. So the crude principle is, if those optics start off being good, they will carry on being good because you've done nothing to them. You've just shifted the point at which the lens focuses. With things like the Raynox, you are adding extra elements, extra glass on the front of the lens, and therefore you are slightly at the mercy of how good that glass is. I believe the Raynox ones in the scheme of things are pretty good. I've not tried them personally, but I believe they're pretty good. But that's the weakness of them. And it will depend how well those additional bits of glass marry up with the lens. Will of course depend on the lens that you're bolting it on the front of. So they'll work better with some lenses and less well with others. We tend to favour the extension tubes because they don't have that direct additional glass optical influence on the high quality lenses that we're using. Do we have any more questions?
Oh, we did. A quick one that I've just seen is they missed the beginning, so what camera are you using? Because that's quite a nice easy one.
That's an easy one to do. So if you've just joined us, welcome. We are shooting with Canon cameras this evening. We're lucky enough to have on the tripod here a new Canon 1DX Mark III, their flagship EF mount pro body. Awesome camera. We do have over on the side, just to be a little bit more kind of real world, we have a 90D, which is their latest offering in the APS-C lineup, and we have an EOS R that is representing the new RF mount mirrorless offering as well. I guess I just like the 1 series, so I kind of just put that out by preference. So we've got a new subject out. I think I'm just going to get this on the screen just while we're thinking about any more questions. The beauty of these little guys, this is a immature, sub-adult female jungle nymph. We know she's female because she's going green. Don't ask me why that is. That's a nature thing, but the boys have brown clothes and the girls have green clothes when they get bigger. We won't talk about the girls actually becoming significantly larger than the boys because that's very politically incorrect. But anyway, she's a girl, hence the fact that she's got a little bit of a green sheen to her. But they are stick insects, very posh stick insects, but their kind of default position is to stay still. Unless there's some reason to move, everything in the world is nicer and safer if you sit still. So they're perfect subjects for this kind of thing. They're also perfect subjects because they have a lot of depth to them. They have a lot of front to back depth with antenna and legs and things. So it's a good way of kind of illustrating depth of focus or depth of field. Another question.
One tip for taking pictures in the wild, say of spiders or lizards, what would it be?
I guess, that's tricky, isn't it? Because one tip is just one idea. I guess this evening what we're trying to talk about is 3 ideas. We're talking about 3 ideas in a number of different directions, but if you can bring in those same 3 ideas to photography inside or outside, with captive stuff, with wild stuff, with super small stuff or bigger stuff, the principles are all the same. So the first point, if you weren't here at the beginning, was having the right equipment to simply get close enough. So if you've got those right lenses, you fundamentally know that you've got the capability to get close enough to get that small subject big enough in the picture to get the composition that you're looking for. The second thing, which we've just been talking about, is managing the focus in the image. We want to make sure that we can get enough focus in the subject to get the effect that we want. We're going to do 2 shots, just to illustrate that point, 2 shots in a minute to show depth of field again with this little guy. The third point, which we haven't quite come onto yet, is having a sufficiently short, fast shutter speed to control movement in the picture-taking scenario. And this is where the wild presents more obstacles than this lovely controlled captive environment. As I'm shooting at the moment, I've got a rock solid Gitzo tripod, lovely camera, perfectly still subject, nice additional lights. The whole thing is relatively easy. If I was out in a dimly lit forest with the breeze blowing, with no tripod, hand holding the ever increasingly heavy 1DX as we're hand holding it, that all becomes much more of an issue, much more of a problem. And of course you're not going to get sharp images if there is camera movement or subject movement being allowed to creep in to the resulting image by way of having insufficiently short, fast shutter speeds. So I guess if we try to bring that down to one recommendation is shoot with the right apertures and shutter speeds. Of course, that's much more complicated than just, like a set of magic numbers, but those are the 2 controls that are going to influence apertures, depth of field, what the focus is going to like, and shutter speed is going to influence movement control. Now, if we come on to that third point of movement control, just briefly so that you understand what we're describing, if you like, what we're replicating here is a bit like outside. So I have reasonably bright light, not very bright. It's amazing how bright outside is to inside when you compare artificial light to natural light. And you can kind of see that if we wanted to shoot at f16, this little guy, I need to be at ISO 2500 at 30th of a second, even with 4 big posh continuous LED lights illuminating the top of the subject here. So we're already under a bit of pressure because of the quantity of light. So we're demonstrating this as a version of relatively dim outside light, and it's causing me the same issues as dim outside light would have. Of course, if I open that aperture up to f2.8, I can balance the exposure, way up now, 1/1250th of a second, which of course means I could flex those two things down. I could push the ISO right down to something a little bit more, let's do something a little bit more sensible, like 400 ISO, and now we're getting perfectly workable shutter speeds of like 200th of a second. So it's all about the balancing of those three controls: the ISO, the sensitivity, the aperture, size of hole in the lens and resulting depth of field, and then the shutter speed to control the movement. Let's imagine that I'm hand holding the camera and maybe our little guy is moving a bit. I would need speeds up in the hundreds to be able to control that movement. I'm deliberately preventing that being an issue by having a still subject and by putting the camera on a tripod. If the subject's not moving and the camera's not moving, let's see if we can demonstrate this. But let's put that ISO right down. Let's pretend we're shooting in film days. I've got Kodak 100 in, so I'm really under pressure now, and I'm gonna try and shoot at not too crazy, f5.6. No, f8. There we go. So I'm shooting at f8, really now down to a shutter speed of only 1/10 of a second. Now I have just got to quickly change one setting, which I'm going to engage the 2-second south timer, because I don't want to wobble the camera as I press the shutter. I just want to see how sharp this picture is going to end up looking. At 100 ISO, f8, 1/10 of a second. Got the south timer going, so boom, boom. Oh Jesus, that's a very long speed. I think that is, that's very long. So it's a long shutter speed. Let's just see what that ends up looking like. That's the resultant image. There we can see 10th second, f8, ISO 100. Let's just see if we can punch in on that a little bit. Get the buttons pressed in the right order. There we go. And we can still count the receptors on the eyes there. So very, very sharp still. So you can see we can get around low light by flexing our settings around, probably resulting in slower shutter speeds, 1/10 of a second. Still perfectly capable of taking a sharp picture based on the fact that the camera's not moving and the subject's not moving. I'm just going to turn off that drive setting, otherwise that's going to freak me out in a minute when the shutter doesn't fire. So you can see how we can work around that. We did just want to do one more illustration of depth of field. This is a great subject to illustrate that. We did this once a minute ago, but let's see if we can do that again. I just want to ramp that ISO back up to a slightly higher level to give me a bit of an option. So I'm going to start by shooting a very wide picture. I'm going to shoot at 2.8, just balance that exposure up a little bit with shutter speed. Let's just see if we can magnify in that live view feed, just so you can get a sense of how critical this focus is. So there we are, we're punched into 5 times magnification on live view, and if I just adjust that, you can see just how critical that is. So I'm going to focus nicely on this right hand compound eye. So I know my focus is pretty good at that point. Let's just try that shot then, 2.8, and then we're just going to flex those settings a little bit. Let's go to the middle aperture again, something like f8. Got to adjust my shutter speed again, balance that exposure up. Just doing that by eye a little bit, but that looks about right to me, something like that. Haven't changed focus, so still focused on the eye, let's do that. And then we'll do that. Let's push the boat out a little bit. Let's do f22, as this guy's going to be pretty cooperative. He's just moving his head a little bit now, bless him. You can just see that, just bobbing up and down his head. Even these little guys move a little bit. I'm not really set a little bit actually. I'm just going to balance that back up again. So I do need a little bit more speed now. I've gone back to 40th of a second because I've got to control that little bit of a head bob. If we zoom in, you can see in the screen, say how the head's just moving. That's him moving. That's nothing else is moving. That's just him. Her, green. Oh, it's all in the colour. She's just moving. We'll take a picture anyway, just to do that feel. So let's just have a quick look at those three examples.
Shall I just move the camera again?
Let's just see if Janet can bring the camera in a little bit again, just as we did a minute ago, so you can see that a little bit more closely. Sorry about the jittery quick release on the tripod there. So this was the shot at 2.8. You can see 2.8 there, and you can see we've really only got focus just on a small part of the face of the jungle nymph. As we go to f8, you can see how that focus jumps out. We're now getting a little bit of the front leg. We've got the mouth in focus, almost round onto that foot because that's tucked round under a chin, but the body is still falling away quite acutely. Go to f16, we've definitely got the front legs now, they're good. We've got the antenna, which is good, through the head, onto the shoulders, a little bit down onto the back. So we are getting better depth of focus or depth of field as we close those apertures down.
What was the shutter speed on 2.8?
So the shutter speed on 2.8, so we were on 1600 ISO for those shots. We were on 1600th of a second at 2.8, 125th of a second at f8, and 1/40th of a second at f16. Exposures might be varying slightly, but you get some sense of what that kind of looks like.
So sorry guys, we are a little bit behind with the questions, but I have noted them all down, so we will go through them. I know one person was struggling with the feed, but I'm really sorry, I don't think it's our end. We have no issues with the internet here, so I'm sorry, I think it might be your end rather than ours. The next question is, what is the background and can it be used outside?
This is the background we're using here is a printed green background. This was made by our very good friends at Lasterlight. Sadly, it is discontinued now though, so you can't buy them. But actually, any kind of green material will do. It just means that we've got something pretty plain to shoot through onto. You can use any kind of green background. The beauty of this setup, of course, is that background will inherently be defocused. If you're focusing on a small subject relatively close to the camera, either inside or outside, what is 2-3 meters away is inherently going to be out of focus. So it hasn't got to be particularly high quality, it's just something to give you a different background. So we'll just try and pick up on a couple more pictures. A couple more questions, sorry. As we're doing that, I'm going to just try and be a little bit ambitious. I'm going to try and pop this extension tube in behind the macro lens and see if we can show you what a macro lens will do with a 25mm extension tube on with this little young lady here. Remember, it's a lady now, which is good, because she's got a really pretty little face, so that's a cool thing. So any other questions as I'm just changing lens?
Yes, general advice on the macro setup, and can you go through it again if you already did it because somebody missed it, but I guess tying in with that, which is the best macro lens?
The macro lens question sort of depends on what camera you've got, because every manufacturer will have a slightly different range of macro lenses. If it's Canon, you have a good choice. Canon make a whole bunch of macro lenses. It will kind of depend whether you're shooting on an EF mount, traditional EF mount camera, or one of the new mirrorless RF mount cameras, and it will depend on whether you've got full frame or crop. For me, the overall kind of all-round top dog macro lens that Canon do is the one that we're using, which is the 100mm 2.8L series. It just kind of ticks a load of boxes. It will work on all of those platforms. It's full frame lens, EF. Obviously work on EFS bodies, 1.6 crop bodies as well, and if you're using the EF RF adapter, will work really well on the RF mount bodies too. 100mm as a focal length just means that we can be a little bit further away, we can be a little bit backed off in terms of our kind of distance. I'm just working on this picture as I'm blubbering, just to see if we can get that kind of roughly in the right place. I'm kind of guessing here a little bit, but I think we're about there. So again, you can't fully appreciate how big or small this subject is. So it's kind of hard for you to realise how close we are. I'm just going to mess with that exposure a little bit, try and get that a little bit more accurate. But I guess her head is probably about the size of a baked bean. I don't know why baked bean comes into my head, but that's that kind of size. Maybe about
small baked bean.
Yeah, maybe 5 millimetres across, 8-9 millimetres in terms of depth. So real small. But I've got the lens is pushed in pretty much to its minimum focusing distance there. I've put that EF extension tube behind it. So we are probably producing a reproduction ratio image of about 1.3, 1.4 times life size there. It really helps. I don't know if you can see the camera there. I don't know if Janet can pan the camera around a little bit. This is the reason that I've got it set up like this. I don't need to have this camera on a focusing rail. But in this sort of situation, to prevent me needing to keep moving the tripod or moving the subject, if I've got a focusing rail, I can slide the camera backwards and forwards. It gives me maybe about 80 mil of movement front to back, which just means if I'm massively out on my focus, I can push that camera further forward until I'm there or thereabouts. And I've still got the camera on the tripod. I've not had to move anything. It just gives me a good kind of option. Let's see. The beauty of this 1DX Mark III is it's very good at high ISO, so we're going to put that under a little bit of pressure at the moment. Put the ISO of 6400. I'm going to take my aperture to f20 to try and give me a little bit of help there. Going to use that self timer again because I really don't want to be wobbling the camera. So I've got a 2-second self timer. I'm going to try and get the focus about halfway between her nose and her eye, something like that. And let's hope that nothing moves, and we'll see what that looks like. There we go, that's the resulting image. This flashed up on preview. So we're shooting at f20, ISO 6400, 20th of a second, f20, and I'm getting pretty good focus, hopefully, on her chops there. And we're now looking at this eye here, this compound eye is probably less than 1 millimetre across. So we are, really pushing into serious kind of levels of detail. Very, very small things. So a 100mm macro lens with the addition of something like an extension tube, a 25mm extension tube, starts to give you access to these kind of real small images. In an ideal world, I'd probably bolster my light levels a little bit, try and drive that shutter speed up a little bit, just so that I can prevent, you can see she's moving just a little bit, just to prevent that movement coming through in the resulting images. Another question.
Could you do that at f22 as well? Do we know when diffraction comes in? I know I've done 22 before and it's been okay.
Both of those questions are good, because you'd be asking why am I sticking there? The lens goes to f32, so why am I sticking at about f20? And it's because of this principle of diffraction. Tends to be particularly noticeable in macro lenses, much more suppressed with the high quality macro lenses. This particular 100mm is really very good at diffraction suppression, but I tend to top out at about f20, f22. I don't tend to push the lens right down to its minimum. It's just kind of a traditional old-fashioned safety net that you don't push the lenses to the minimum apertures to open up the door to diffraction. If you don't know what diffraction is, it is basically just the quality of the lens goes off the boil. The sharpness goes off the boil as you close those apertures right down to their minimum. So we push our lenses up to about f20 maybe, as Janet was saying, f22, rather than going through to f32, which the lens has as a capability. You might find the answer is to try it. Try shooting it at f32. If you like the results and you think they're okay, great. The pictures are all about what pleases you. But from our kind of slightly play it safe traditional point of view, we tend to top out at about f20, f22. It's definitely a more noticeable problem with older macro lenses. So if you go out and buy a second-hand macro lens maybe that may be 10, 15, 20, 25 years old, diffraction maybe is something that is a little bit more apparent in those older lenses.
Cool. Just to say, sorry if anybody is having issues. I can see a couple of people are. I can't see that we're having any issues here. But of course, the video will save to the phone, which we will share with the Campkins guys, so they can put that up afterwards,
Yeah,
which
so
will be a clean
up
feed.
On the Cambridge Photography Week Facebook page anyway, so if you want to come back and watch it again, apologies if there are some connection problems. We've got a monitor running here on a separate line, and it looks like it's working all right from our point of view, so apologies if it's not coming through to you.
It is a Manfrotto focusing rail. I can't remember the number of it. I should know
blah,
this.
Blah, blah. I think it's an 029.
Yeah, something like that. It's a Manfrotto.
454. How wrong can you be? 454 focusing rail. Very good, very good. Focusing rails, you can get a ton of different ones. The Manfrotto ones are just a kind of good medium point. They're well made, all metal construction. About 80 quid, I think, that kind of amount. And I often have them mounted as the camera is now. Not necessarily because I think I'm going to need them for every single shot, but it's amazing how useful it is when you're almost in the right position just to be able to unlock the platform and slide the platform backwards and forwards. Even if it's just only by a centimetre or two, it just gives you that little bit of freedom, to do some different stuff. I'm just going to pop that extension tube back out again. Let's see if we can maybe do any more questions, if there are any, and then we might try and do, for a bit of a finale, because we've got about 15 minutes left, I think. We've played safe so far. We've gone for things that we know are going to behave, like good old Mitchell the Gecko and Jungle Nymph here are all going to be kind of very safe bets. But we might try, push the boat out a little bit, and we're going to try a frog maybe as a kind of, and then you'll see why we've left that to the end probably. Just taking that extension tube out because that gives me then a little bit of versatility to back the camera off a little bit, and then we'll be able to frame the frog up. Another question maybe?
Yeah, so I'll leave you with a question, although I do have to very quickly say hello to Albert. I know I shouldn't really do that, but Albert was, unfortunately for him, stuck here with us for 7 months, bless him, but he's managed to escape now, so I just wanted to say hello. Do we recommend mirror lockup to reduce vibration?
Good point. Hello Albert also. Hope the weather's better in Barcelona than it is here. You're definitely in the right part of Europe probably at the moment. Mirror lockup. So all of these traditional SLR cameras, single lens reflex cameras, they have a mirror in them, a moving mirror. The point of mirror lockup is that you can force that mirror up before the picture is taken, press the shutter to take the picture, and then let the mirror come back down again. And that eliminates any vibration that the mirror movement is going to cause through the camera. If you haven't got mirror lockup, or indeed you do what I'm just doing, which is shooting off of live view, of course if you're in live view the mirror is out the way anyway, because you are seeing a live feed off of the sensor beforehand, so you haven't got the mirror in the way in the first place. So if you're running on live view, that kind of does a similar thing, but historically yes, we might have done mirror lockup if we're very worried. These cameras, the mirror movement is very well suppressed, and if you've got a really good solid tripod, that's less of an issue. So if you're worried about it, use it by all means, but it's another step in the process that can kind of slow you down a little bit. Tripod. Is that a question of what tripod?
Yeah. Oh, sorry. Yes. What tripod are we using?
I have to say, and those people that know me will confirm that tripods are a bit of a thing for me. I've been photographing pretty much all of my adult life, and tripods have been a part of that right the way through the last 40 odd years. So tripods are a super important part of any photographer's toolkit. And why are they important? They're important because they keep the camera still. It is really that simple. So if you think about that, you know, your tripod is a really vital kind of tool. This is a Geckos Systematic 4 Series tripod, 5-section systematic tripod. Not cheap, I'll grant you that. They're not cheap tripods, but they are just fantastic. Absolutely rock solid. I won't do it now, but I am confident that I could sit on this and it would take even my substantial weight, no problem at all. They are super, super well engineered. Not cheap tripods, but it's the kind of thing that you'll buy and they'll last you forever, pretty much. I've still got My original Gitzo systematic tripod, which is maybe 35 years old, and bar scratches and being a bit knackered, it is just as good as it was the day I bought it. So very, very good tripods. We've got a ball and socket head on it. Heads are also very important. Obviously we're talking about the legs. What head you have on the tripod is important. This is again a Gitzo systematic ball head. Again, not cheap but very good. And ball heads are just very versatile. They kind of do everything pretty well. So we tend to have ball and socket heads on the tripods by default. If I was doing a lot of macro stuff, I might fit a geared head. Manfrotto do some really nice geared heads. We've got a couple of geared heads from them. And that means that I haven't got to move the camera and lock it off. I move each one of the 3 planes of movement, pan, tilt and horizon correction, independently on a gearing. Very, very good for fine-tuning your compositions and not having to lock the tripod off. So they geared heads, very, very good for macro photography and landscape photography. So hopefully that answers that question. Invest in a good tripod.
I was going to say, are there any tips for when you're choosing them? And I guess the best one is to buy the heaviest one you're willing to carry, isn't it?
Yeah, you probably just heard that from Janet. The old adage is the best tripod you can have is the one that you've got with you. So if you end up buying a tripod that is fundamentally too big and heavy that you end up leaving it in the boot of the car, it doesn't work very well in the boot of the car. The reality for all of us is the bigger and heavier the tripod is, the better it will work. The more stable it will be, the better it will control movement in the camera. It's purely how much weight you feel you can cope with. I've grown up with big heavy tripods, so for me this is a real lightweight one. But just have something that is right for you. The biggest, heaviest tripod that you think you will actually take out. But fundamentally, the bigger and heavier they are, the better they're going to work. Carbon fiber's good because in terms of weight versus rigidity, they have the best compromise. But equally, you know, the traditional aluminium tripods will work well too. Aha, right, we've just been joined by...
This is Viking.
Viking. This is Viking the frog. We have 2 of these, one called Viking and one called Stretch. Long, boring explanation of why that is. But these are a species called red spot milk frogs. Really nice little guys. And he's kind of been in training. That sounds like he's been doing weights and things. It's not. All the animals we have here, you should be assured, by the way, that all the animals we have here are all part of our animal team. We are fully licensed and all that kind of stuff. So it's a big part of what we do, managing the animals in a very kind of responsible way. So these are new guys. We tend to get the animals when they're relatively young, and then very, very gradually, over weeks and months, we try and get them used to being handled. It just becomes part of their normal routine. Lifted out of their cage, they have the cage cleaned, lifted back again, and gradually over weeks and months they get more and more used to it. They get habituated to that. So this little guy has been out having his picture taken a fair bit in the last month or so, and as you can see he's really good at kind of sitting there. So I'm going to push a little bit closer because I'd like a slightly tighter composition. We've got that extension tube out now, so we've got the freedom to kind of move this around a little bit. We can do some quite cool things, and the stick is pretty straight here, you can see on the screen there, but there's nothing to stop me kind of introducing a bit of a diagonal, so I can make that maybe look a little bit more funky, a little bit more corner to corner, just by adjusting the angle of the camera. And probably that's not going to notice too much, but it might introduce a little bit more kind of a dynamic feel to the composition. I've got to get the focus right between the eyes and ideally the nose. I want to shoot maybe at about something like f11, f13, and that with the ISO that I'm on, that's a perfectly doable combo. I'm just going to bring the focus slightly forward of the eyes, just about there maybe. Just tweak that composition a tiny bit, put him off centre a little bit. Just adjust that exposure a tiny bit, just to make sure. We're kind of balancing the exposure up. I'm doing that all by eye. I can bring the light meter up if I want to. There we go, it's on the side there. But even the light meter of the camera is a little bit fooled by him being relatively bright and the background. I can bring a histogram up as well, of course. That gives me a pretty good reading. I just want to worry about not burning out those highlights too much. So about there's fine. Some shadows, some mid-tones, not clipping the highlights too much. That will be pretty good. Focus just in front of the eye. I've still got the 2-second self timer on, so press the shutter, let go. Boom, there we go. And we'll just see how that looks. Let's get rid of all that junk in the way. And there we go. A picture of Viking. He does look a little bit drunk, so maybe we'll straighten him up a little bit.
So a couple more questions for
questions,
you.
Yeah.
Would you use a gimbal head for moving subjects such as insects outside?
Gimbal heads are great. They take the weight of the camera and the lens and enable you to follow subjects. For macro photography, in my experience, probably not. Long lenses, absolutely. If you're shooting big telephoto lenses, the traditional kind of approach of a quality gimbal is very good. Macro, I don't know, it depends how much the subject's moving. You struggle a little bit with control and positioning with a gimbal sometimes. You struggle to lock it off a little bit sometimes. I tend to just use a good quality ball and socket head. You can see that I'm pretty capable of managing that position, getting him in the right position, locking that head off, and there's very little drift when I lock the head off, and that's a sign of a good head. As you lock it off, you're not getting any kind of drift as the locking mechanism cuts in. Any more questions? I think
Do we use spot metering for macro?
We do sometimes, yeah. I mean, things like metering pattern, whether you're using evaluative, matrix style metering, or centre weighted, or spot metering, is more about the tonal range in the subjects than the type of subject that you're shooting. So if the subject is the same tone and is illuminated in the same way as the background, then pretty much any metering pattern will be fine. This is slightly awkward because you can see from the histogram the frog is significantly brighter than the majority of the background. So he's maybe like 2 stops brighter. So that is going to cause evaluative matrix metering some issues in terms of getting a good reading off of that. And spot metering will solve that. Of course, you have to make sure that the spot is on the right part of the frame, not the wrong part. So you have to make sure that the reading is taken off the frog and not a shadow on the stick or something.
And I guess you have to be careful with spot metering because a lot of cameras do that from the centre point rather than where you want it.
The big thing you have to check out on the spec of the camera, this one's very good because this one will move where the spot reading is taken to follow the focus point. So if I move the focus point around the frame, the spot reading is taken from where the focus point is. Some cameras with lesser specifications may have the reading stuck in the middle regardless of where the focus point ends up. So just check on your specifications of your camera just to make sure you understand where that reading is being taken from.
We are running out of time because we have gone over by about 2 minutes now, so I'm sorry about that. The last question I've seen is about fixed lighting, if you could talk about fixed lighting.
Fixed lighting, actually. We're going to overrun by maybe 5 minutes. Apologies if the kettle's boiled and you want a cup of tea, but we're going to overrun a little bit. We've done all of this evening with continuous lighting. You get a little bit of a sense of, Janet's just going to pan the camera up so you can see that a little bit. The only modification we've done to this lighting setup, this is 4 little daylight balanced LED panels. The only modification is we are pushing that light through a diffuser. 2 reasons why that is. One is the reason that we want more diffused light. We're trying to replicate the look of the sky above the frog. So that nice, soft, diffused light, top light, a little bit of light bounced up from underneath with the reflector, and then still some light in the room, that works really well. The other reason, and let's see if we can illustrate this a little bit, I might be able to show you because this little dude will do it probably. Let's just look at this frog's eye. There you go. Look at the catch light in the eye. And the eye is going to reflect whatever is illuminating it. So I'm getting a pretty clean catch light in that frog's eye. It's pretty much one spot of light. If I had 4 direct LED panels with all those little LED lights, that would be a much less pleasant catch light in the eye. So that's another reason why we push the light through diffusers, just so we have pleasant catch lights in the eye. And there's no reason why, let's just see if we can prove that point. when we take a picture and look at it on replay, so there we are on replay, press the right buttons again, there we go. There's no reason why you shouldn't have, super good detail, that you can be, seeing this kind of level of detail in the eyes and in the catch lights and stuff like that. So that's the reason we use it. We do also use, which we haven't really used this evening because we've just run out of time, we have a ton of flashlight as well. We were going to talk about some Canon speed lights. I've got a couple of Canon speed lights there. Again, with some diffusers on, similar kind of reasons, diffusing the light a little bit. We had preemptively put an SG3 radio trigger on the top of the camera for using those guns, but we've kind of run out of time. And that's great as well, because flashlight offers a couple of really fundamental additional advantages above continuous light. One being pure output. These flash guns are capable of walloping out such a greater amount of light than LEDs are capable of doing, albeit for a very short period of time. So pure output, pure brightness, if you like, flash guns are always going to win. And you have a second advantage is movement control by way of flash duration, which is a little bit more technical, but these guns push that flash of light out a very, very short duration, and that helps control movement. So flashlights work very good. Apart from that, in the studio here, we're blessed with having a big barrel of Electron lights, Electron studio lights, which have been our mainstay lighting here for over 10 years. Works super, super good. These lights have been, hammered over the years. Hundreds of thousands of activations, and they work really, really well. The studio lights, of course, have the advantage of being plugging into the mains, so they don't run out of batteries. Much quicker recycling time because of the circuitry. They're adaptable in terms of fitting soft boxes and brollies and diffusers and snoops and reflectors, so you can modify light and play with it in a really kind of cool way. So those kind of studio lights, like the Electron lights, will be super good in a studio environment. But if you were out and about, things like the Canon speed lights are also very, very good too. So I think we're getting to about 10 minutes over, so have we got any more questions, or are we there?
I think we're just about there, but we will look back and see if we've missed any, and if we have, then obviously either ourselves or Campkins will answer those. We will also send on the images that we took today, so if people want to review those because they couldn't see them very well, we'll send those on so you can have a look. So we hope you all enjoyed it, and do obviously check the schedule for all the other events, because I know there's lots of other things going on. So thanks everyone for joining us.
Thank you very much. The Cambridge Photography Week Facebook page is going to be rammed with this stuff over the next week, so do check out all of those things. If you struggle getting questions through to us, just message the guys on that Facebook page, and I'm sure they'll forward them on to us. Thank you all very much for joining us. I hope that's entertained you. It's been a bit boring actually, because we've had no major animal incidents. There's no frog on the face or anything. But it just shows how he's still sat there now, bless him. He's so well behaved. So thank you very much. I hope that's been good. Enjoy the rest of the evening. Enjoy all the other events on the Cambridge Photography Week Facebook page, and we'll see you all soon. Thank you.